Kapunda is the kind of South Australian town where you can hear your own footsteps at night. The main drag beds down early, porch lights do most of the work, and the darkness feels more like a blanket than a warning. On Harriet Street, a low-slung weatherboard house sat behind a neat fence and a lemon tree that always seemed to be trying. Inside lived the Rowe family. Andrew, steady and hands-on, Rose, warm and practical, and their 16-year-old daughter Chantel, small in stature and big in energy, a teenager whose life was opening up faster than she could write it all down. If you ask people who knew them to start with one story, they usually start with a table. Rose said it like ritual: cut fruit, not just biscuits, water glasses topped up without fuss. Andrew could fix anything and made a habit of doing exactly that for whoever asked. Chantel's social world spun in tight circles, the way small-town high school worlds do. Same faces at sport, same laughs on weeknights, same Friday messages. What's the plan? Who's got a lift? Are we on? Kapunda is a place where friends come with history nailed into them. You grow up together, you keep growing, and you assume your town will let you. On the weekend of November 6-7, 2010, Kapunda settled into late spring heat and ordinary chores: a lawn here, a netball game there, dinner by the TV. The Rose moved through it like everyone else. Then came the night that would split the town in two. In the early hours of Monday, November 8th, something entered that house that didn't belong. No one knew it yet. Dawn did what dawn always does. Lights on in kitchens, kettles clicking, work boots by doors. And Kapunda got up into a day that had already been ruined. The discovery did not come from police doing a sweep. It came from the kind of drop-in every Australian town knows: a friend calling past, expecting noise and breakfast smells, and instead walking straight into a silence so hard it felt like pressure in the ears. Within minutes, Harriet Street was a flurry of taped boundaries, gloved hands, blue lights, painting pale fences. Officers know what a burglary looks like. They know what a fight looks like. This did not look like either. Inside the Rowe home, the scene read like a storm with intent. Rooms disturbed in ways that told a story of movement, not mess. Signs of a struggle with no time to recover. Blood where only laughter and laundry had any right to be. Word outran official statements. In towns like this, bad news spreads in circles that overlap. A cousin hears from a neighbor who saw a patrol car sprint through a stop sign. A mother texts a daughter, "Stay put, something's happened." People drove to the edge of Harriet Street and then stopped themselves, remembering that tragedy deserves space. By mid-morning, Kapunda understood only what absence tells you. 3 people were not picking up their phones, and the house that held them was now a crime scene. Names have weight. When the UI police confirmed them, the weight landed everywhere at once. Andrew, Rose, Chantel, dead. Multiple wounds, no survivors. A triple murder in a town that had never rehearsed that phrase. The details were not released, but rumors don't wait politely for press conferences. Teachers at the local school closed their office doors and let themselves cry for a minute before drafting careful notes to staff. Friends who had left Kapunda years earlier called home to ask if it was true. The answer wasn't a paragraph. It was a sound. One small word said, slowly, "Yes." Detectives flooded the town. Kapunda's quiet streets became a canvas for grids and door knocks. Officers mapped routes in chalk and notebooks. The path to the front door, the back gate, the way the fence could be cleared. Which windows faced which streetlights. They logged the house the way a doctor logs a body. Every bruise to be explained by a mechanism. Every room to be read for how it had been used against its owners. The first working theory was the one that fits so many home invasions: random violence or a burglary gone mad. That theory didn't last long. Violence tells you things, and this violence spoke a personal language. The wounds were numerous and focused. Whoever came into the Rowe home stayed long enough to do more than take. They stayed to destroy. That distinction matters because intent lives in edges. A thief wants away. This person wanted the rose gone. Investigators began to tilt their questions toward the people nearest the family, not to cast shadows, but because the odds in cases like this lean toward familiarity. Who had keys? Who knew the routine? Who had argued, even casually, in recent days? Who knew Chantel's social patterns, her friendships, the lines young people draw around themselves when they're figuring out who they are? Rose and Andrew's friends started the second job that always runs alongside an investigation, holding each other up. Meals arrived for family who couldn't taste. Guest rooms were made up for relatives who flew in. Someone set up a table at the football club to collect cards and flowers and memories of the ordinary kind that police reports don't record. How Rose made you feel at home. How Andrew was the kind of man you called first when something went wrong. How Chantel filled a room with her voice, even when she was saying hardly anything. Kapunda is not a place that ignores its dead. It speaks their names until the speaking hurts less. Detectives moved outward from Harriet Street in rings, neighbors, friends, schoolmates, anyone who had seen a car or a person at odd hours. They pulled camera footage from service stations and shop fronts up and down the highway. They secured the Rose phones and computer, calendars, and notebooks, anything that could sketch the previous 48 hours. At the same time, forensic teams burrowed inward. Blood pattern analysis, footprints, trace material, the silent witnesses that stick to hands and clothes when hands and clothes have been where they should not have been. Early media reports talked about a frenzied attack, and while the police did not confirm adjectives, the command in their voices told the same truth. The person they were hunting had met resistance and crushed it. What did Kapunda do? It did what small towns always do when put under impossible strain: turned vigil into infrastructure. Candles were lit along the footpath outside the house, and someone taped photos to the fence. Rose's smile, Andrew's arm around his daughter, Chantel's teenage pose, the half-shy, half-bold moment before the shutter. A fundraiser sprang up because practical help is the first language of shock. In the supermarket, people lowered their voices and put extra into trolleys they knew would go to the right doorstep. And all the while, under the quiet, the question ran like current. Who could do this and why? By midweek, the investigators' public face changed. The random intruder theory had been tested and found thin. The language tilted towards certainty without names. The manhunt was not for a drifter. It was for someone who knew the family, knew the house, and knew Chantel. That last part hung in the air. It said motive without saying motive. It told Kapunda the story was not about a house in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about a person whose want had learned the shape of a knife. The search kept widening even as the focus narrowed. Detectives asked anyone who had been out late to come forward: drivers, dog walkers, shift workers who lived by night. They appealed for sightings of anyone with injuries that couldn't be explained: hands or faces cut by a struggle, torn clothing in a town where you notice those things. Behind the scenes, they were also doing a quieter, more intimate kind of work, tracing Chantel's friendships, the boys around her world, the jealousies and crushes that can become accelerants when mixed with resentment and fantasy. No one said the word yet, but the shape was there: obsession. The idea that someone close had wanted something from Chantel she wouldn't give, and that this refusal, this ordinary, necessary exercise of her right to choose, had detonated into something unspeakable. In the days to come, Kapunda would learn names and hear confessions, and a young man who had blended into candlelight vigils would step into a courtroom and call his acts by their true names. For now, Part 1 ends where detectives were on those first nights: a family dead, a town awake, and a line of inquiry pointing inward, to the trusted circle around a teenage girl whose life should have been allowed to stay small and beautiful and ordinary. In the first 48 hours, Kapunda did what shocked towns do. It set plates on doorsteps, lit candles on Harriet Street, and tried to breathe around a question with no shape. The police did what homicide squads do. They turned a house into a map. Every room was read like a paragraph. Every smear, scuff, and footprint was a verb to be conjugated. Who did this, how, and in what order? Within those first sweeps, the idea of a stranger faded. The violence was too focused, too prolonged, too personal. This was not a grab and run. Someone stayed. Detectives worked outward in rings. Neighbors, friends, teammates, anyone who knew the Rose routine. They learned quickly that Chantel had a tight social circle and that circles in towns like this overlap: school, sport, weekend hangouts, the hand-me-down friendship chains that start in primary and don't really end. One name kept landing in interviews with a particular frequency. He was Jason, slight, a few years older than Chantel, more present on the periphery than at the center, someone who orbited her group with the persistence of a crush that hadn't learned its limits. He wasn't a boyfriend. He wasn't family. He was there. On paper, Jason Downey did not look like the kind of person who could erase a family. At barely 52 kilos, narrow-shouldered, a little weedy, he passed for harmless in a town where men like Andrew Rowe were the default, a practical, broad-armed dad who could lift and mend. But homicide reminds you that violence is not a body type. It's a decision that discovers a method. The first serious crack came not from DNA but from behavior. Downey was conspicuous by how inconspicuous he tried to be. He turned up to the vigil. He stood in the half-light with other friends and family, head bowed the way you do when everyone else is looking at the ground. He offered sympathy. He asked if anyone had heard anything. He looked like a person trying to find a place for his hands. But people who had known him since school felt an off note, a rehearsed sorrow, a way of asking questions that felt more like checking what others knew than sharing what he knew. Detectives, meanwhile, were building a structure the town couldn't see. Timelines stitched from CCTV, service station cameras, and phone records. The arc of a weekend turned into coordinates. Kapunda, like everywhere, has lenses no one thinks about until the police ask for footage. A servo at the highway, security on a shop awning, a private camera aimed at a driveway because of a long-ago break-in. Together, those frames work like a long exposure. They caught comings and goings that didn't fit sleep. They caught a figure moving at hours that looked wrong. They didn't spell a name. They drew a shape. When officers sat Downey down for a formal talk, the conversation began with the politeness homicide uses to see whether a story can carry its own weight. He said the right things. He was shocked. He'd been home. He didn't know anything. He showed his hands when asked and said the cuts and scratches were from something ordinary. A fall, a bike mishap, anything but what they looked like, which was resistance written on skin. The problem for him wasn't just the marks. It was the clock. Phone data does not have an imagination. It knows where it was and when. His device told a different story than his mouth. Inside the Rowe home, trace evidence began to harden into something you can take to a judge. Blood told routes through rooms. Drag marks explained how bodies were moved. Cleanup attempts, water here, wiped surfaces there, read like consciousness of guilt, not confusion. And there was biological material that did not belong to the Rose, DNA that, when processed, gave detectives a way to compare names to profiles. One of those names was Jason. One of those profiles matched. What the lab can't tell you, quickly people can. Friends sketched the months leading up to the murders, Downey's fixation growing as Chantel made clear she wasn't interested, the way his mood pivoted when she spent time with someone else, jealousy seasoned with entitlement. A small-town boy's idea that wanting should be able to bend someone else's no. Investigators listened for more than gossip. They listened for pattern. Calls late at night, turning up. Uninvited. The way a joke can become a test when a boy is measuring how far he can press. When police widened the interview to people who had seen Downey in the days after the killings, more puzzle pieces landed. Someone remembered him asking about whether the weapon had been found. Someone else remembered him mentioning clothing and shoes, as if those items mattered more than grief. Those details weren't proof by themselves, they were flags. Then came a turn that no true crime writer could invent and have you believe. Downey agreed to help. Under careful questioning, he led officers to a spot outside town, where he said he dumped what he was wearing. The same items friends remembered him being oddly curious about. The knives he claimed to have discarded were never recovered. But you don't need a blade to tell you who used it if the rooms and bodies already have. As detectives filled the board with timelines, they saw the part of the story no one outside the house had witnessed. Andrew Rowe, hearing something at the wrong hour, rose to confront an intruder. He was attacked first, stabbed again and again, overwhelmed where he should have been strongest. Rose tried to escape, was cut down with even greater ferocity, a fury that looked like hatred at resistance. Chantel, likely hiding in terror, was found and attacked with catastrophic violence that did not end at murder. The scene spoke of rape, of a killer who took what had been refused in life, then tried to wash and arrange a lie across the house. The brutality was not random, the sequencing not accidental. This was purpose. By the time police put cuffs on Downey, the public case was still a rumor and a fear. But the evidential case, the one that has to survive disclosure and a Supreme Court's standards, had a spine. A suspect with injuries he lied about. A digital trail that contradicted his alibi. DNA and scene work that tied him to where he said he wasn't. And post-offense behavior, disposal, questions about the investigation, turning up at the vigil, that read like the choreography of someone trying to manage discovery. He cracked not with a cinematic confession, but with a sequence of admissions that learned to imitate the facts as they emerged. First, he was nowhere near the house. Then, maybe he had gone by. Then, perhaps there had been an argument. Then, something had happened that got out of hand. He said sorry in words that didn't match the planning of bringing knives, of moving bodies, of attempting to clean. He wrote an apology letter that defense would later waive as a sign of remorse, and that the court would later weigh against the reality of what he did. While police ran evidence to the lab and prosecutors began drafting charges, Kapunda had to do something with all the extra silence in its days. The high school pulled students into small rooms and told them the careful version of the truth, then let them cry loud, because careful doesn't mean quiet. Parish halls filled with casseroles. Football club kitchens turned into logistics hubs. And at the house on Harriet Street, officers in white suits moved slowly through what had been a family's life, cataloging it with the tenderness of people who know that their neat lists are the last kindness they can offer. The random intruder story died without a funeral. In its place stood motive in plain clothes, obsession and resentment disguised as romance, rejection treated like an insult to be corrected, an 18-year-old who read no as a challenge and wrote his answer in knives. When the charges were finally read, 3 counts of murder, with the sexual violence woven into the narrative of Chantel's final minutes, a town that had been speaking in candles learned to pronounce the case in legal terms. It didn't make anything better. It made it processable. When the case finally reached Adelaide's Supreme Court, the question wasn't who. It was how the law would record what had happened inside the Rowe home, and how long it would keep the man who did it from ever walking Kapunda's streets again. Jason Alexander Downey was 20 by then, smaller than the crime he carried, dressed in the neutral clothes defendants wear when they hope looking plain can soften what a file already makes hard. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder. There would be no trial about identity, no jury to persuade. Instead, the court would hear the story in full for the first time. Not rumor, not whispers over fences, but evidence under oath. What the scene looked like in the harsh light of forensics, what the bodies had endured, and why the judge would later call it not just savage, but something that word couldn't quite reach. The director of public prosecution stood and told the narrative the House had already written. Andrew Rowe, roused in the middle of the night, met an intruder in his own hallway and was stabbed 29 times. The force and focus of the wounds told their own story. This wasn't about escape. It was about erasure. Rose Rowe, trying to flee, was stabbed at least 50 times, an escalation that read like rage at resistance, a punishment for trying to live. Chantel, 16, was stabbed more than 30 times, and then, while she was dying or newly dead, sexually assaulted. The prosecutor did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He described the blood that smeared the floors like a river, the drag marks, the attempts at washing and wiping that the pathologists called what they are in such cases, consciousness of guilt. He explained how a tip of a knife was later found lodged in skull tissue, how the violence had outlasted one blade's strength and carried on anyway. The court listened to the sequence because order matters. Downey did not panic and lash out once. He moved through rooms, returned to bodies after already stabbing them, and stabbed again. He brought knives with him and then claimed he had lost control, as if control could be lost after arriving with the tools of murder. He told lies to police about where he was, about the cuts on his hands and forearms, about how his clothes got wet. Then, when each lie broke against the next piece of evidence, phone data, CCTV, trace, he offered a new version that learned to imitate whatever the science had just said out loud. The defense did what a defense must do after a guilty plea. It tried to color the picture around the crime without blurring its lines. They called Downey immature, weedy, a boy of 52 kilos who seemed incapable of overpowering a grown man like Andrew or inflicting such fury on Rose and Chantel. They said jealousy and infatuation had curdled into something he didn't recognize in himself, that he'd been consumed by rejection and humiliation because Chantel had chosen someone else. They pointed to an apology letter he wrote and to the fact that he later cooperated, leading police to the place where he dumped his clothes and shoes. They reminded the judge that he had joined the vigil, stood among mourners, and that his family was as shocked as anyone at what he had done. But a courtroom is the wrong place to argue with physics. The pathologist explained the injuries in clinical terms that made anyone listening sit straighter. Manual strength had been applied over minutes, not moments. The pattern of wounds on each victim matched the order the House suggested. There were post-attack cleanup attempts. Chantel's injuries showed sexual violation that had occurred after the stabbings began. A forensic officer mapped footwear impressions, bloodstain patterns, and the water-silt mixture on clothing and shoes that tied Downey to exactly the spaces he swore he hadn't entered. A police analyst took the court through cell site records, where Downey's phone sat when it shouldn't have, when it moved, when it went silent, and how that track contradicted the ordinary alibi he'd offered before the evidence started speaking. Victim impact statements arrived like a tide that doesn't apologize for its volume. Christopher Rowe, the family's only surviving child, told the court what it was like to be on holiday while your family is destroyed, and to come home to a town that has learned to tiptoe around your name. He talked about emptiness and noise, how grief is both too much and not enough. Friends and relatives stood and said the words people imagine they will be too polite to say: hatred, anger, why, how. The judge let them say it. The law cannot punish for anger, but it can record harm. And a court that records harm honestly is a court that respects the people whose lives are being put into its book. The defense tried to salvage a story of remorse, that the guilty plea spared the community a trial, that youth should carry some weight, that life with a far-off parole horizon would still be life measured in decades. The prosecutor reminded the court that the pleas came only after the case's structure had become impossible to dodge. DNA at the scene, digital timelines, contradictions under interview, and behavior after the murders. Attending the vigil, probing others about the search, leading police to discarded clothing while claiming not to remember where he'd thrown knives, painted what the judge later called a portrait of calculation, not chaos. When Justice John Sulin finally spoke the words that fix a case in memory, he did it with the calm that makes heavy things heavier. He called the crimes chilling and truly horrific, and said even savage was not enough to cover what went on in that house. He said the evidence satisfied him that Downey went there driven by a desire to have a sexual relationship with Chantel Rowe, and that the deaths of 3 innocent people in their own home were the result of that jealousy and rage. He noted the lies, the attempted cleanup, the returning to bodies, and the sexual assault. He acknowledged the guilty pleas because judges must, and discounted the final number by years to reflect them. Then he did what the community had been waiting for. He imposed life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years. The number landed with the kind of silence that sounds like breathing after being held too long. 35 years means he will be well into middle age before the system even considers whether he can safely exist outside a wall. It does not promise release then. It promises an opportunity for a parole board to read the file and ask whether risk, remorse, and insight can outweigh what the judge called enormity, a word the law rarely uses because it's hard to measure. For the other counts surrounding what was done to Chantel, the court passed sentences that make clear they were not swallowed by the murders. They sit alongside, a legal acknowledgement that one night held more than one crime. Outside, microphones waited at the bottom of the steps because they always do. The police spoke in the professional register of people who've walked through rooms no one should see. This is how the case was built. CCTV, phones, trace, behavior, and this is the help the town gave us. Family members stood together, not because statements can fix anything, but because saying a name keeps it from getting lost in the legal terms my office uses for clarity. They asked the public to remember Andrew, Rose, and Chantel as the people they were, practical and warm, quick to help, 16 and full of a life owning its own momentum. They thanked Kapunda for feeding and grieving and showing up, even when showing up meant standing under bad lights to hear hard things. Inside the court, the file closed the way such files close, binders marked with dates and Sulin J, exhibits logged and stored. A transcript that has to be exact because words are how the system remembers. For Kapunda, the sentence did something quieter. It ordered the chaos. It wrote into law what the town had already known by instinct and rumor. It told everyone who needed to hear it, especially the young, that obsession is not love, that no is not an insult, and that a boy who joins your vigil can also be the reason you needed one. Sentences don't end stories. They fix a number to a thing that can't be numbered and then leave everyone else to figure out how to live with it. After the judge said life with a 35-year floor, Kapunda stood up from the benches and walked back into ordinary streets that didn't feel ordinary yet. Harriet Street was still a place where you checked your voice before you spoke. The fence out front collected flowers that browned at the edges and were replaced by fresh ones because people needed to keep doing something with their hands. The first work was practical. Police finished what they could finish at the house, packed away tents and tape, and handed the property back to a family that no longer fit inside it. Relatives did what relatives do in the week after a sentencing. They boxed, labeled, argued about small things, and then hugged in doorways. chose which item should go to which house, so memory didn't get concentrated in one room like a storm. The lemon tree in the yard kept trying. A neighbor watered it because that's what neighbors do when there is nothing else to fix. The town learned the choreography of endurance. You say their names in the right order: Andrew, Rose, Chantel. Because names in the right order feel like a spine. You keep showing up at the bakery, the servo, the oval, and you refuse to let the worst night reorganize every room. At the high school, teachers set up a quiet corner where students could land on tough days without having to explain why. At the footy club, someone put 3 initials on a board no one touched. It wasn't a shrine, just a way of making sure certain letters stayed visible when the season moved on. For the one row who didn't die in that house, life became a map of firsts. First time unlocking the door to a home that didn't sound like home. First birthday that felt misdated. First trip to the supermarket where people's kindness weighed as much as the milk. People in Kapunda were good at reading the room. They asked how he was and then let fine be enough when it needed to be. They also learned the courage to ask tougher questions when he wanted them asked. Grief works better with a roster. You spell each other in and out so one person doesn't carry every heavy day alone. Policing turned the case into training. Recruits learned what Harriet Street taught in hard detail: how to read a house like a witness, how to fit CCTV and phone metadata into a timeline jurors can grasp without needing a technician sitting beside them, how post-offense behavior, vigils, inquiries, sudden interest in the whereabouts of knives and shoes, reads when you stack it against biology and clocks. Detectives added slides about obsession and entitlement, about how quickly no can become a fuse for someone who believes wanting is permission. None of it was theory. It was a file with names on it. The community made rituals that didn't ask for microphones. On certain nights, candles appeared along the footpath, not in rows, just 2 or 3 at a time. A church hall hosted teas that looked like any other morning tea until you noticed who always sat at the same table. Local businesses kept a collection tin beside the till longer than they usually would because practical help is how small towns talk about love. On the anniversary, people walked past the house slower than usual and kept their eyes where they belonged, forward. Because staring isn't the same as honoring. Parents started talking to their teenagers differently, not with lectures, but with small sentences that landed. Rejection is not an insult. Jealousy is not proof of love. If a friend or a boyfriend tries to turn no into a negotiation, call it what it is and step away. Tell me where you're going. I'll always come get you. Teachers folded those ideas into health and social lessons, not as fear, but as literacy. They taught what boundaries sound like, how to hear them, how to hold them. They taught the difference between being sorry for how you feel and being responsible for what you do with it. Harriet Street itself needed reclaiming. For a while, it was the road people avoided on evening walks. Then dog owners started taking the long way on purpose. A pair of kids began riding scooters down the verge again, loud enough to make the sound of a street belong to them. Someone mowed the nature strip out front as neatly as if the family were still inside. The point wasn't to erase. The point was to refuse to let one person's violence redraw the map. In letters and interviews that came later, the judge's words kept reverberating. Obsession, jealousy, rage, an attack so sustained the adjectives felt small. People used those words as something like a measuring stick. Anytime they saw a younger boy confuse attention for entitlement, they nudged. Anytime a conversation glorified persistence where it should have honored a boundary, they said so. It wasn't culture war. It was culture care. One small correction at a time, until you could trust a Friday night again. The numbers stayed where the court put them. 35 years means the killer will be older than the town first knew him when anyone considers opening a gate. It doesn't guarantee release then. It guarantees a serious conversation later, with risk, remorse, and insight under lights that don't blink. People asked if that felt like enough. There isn't an answer that satisfies arithmetic against loss. What the number gave was a sense of order and a large quiet space in which Kapunda could do the work of being Kapunda. Meanwhile, the case kept teaching beyond the highway. Conferences for prosecutors in other states ran a session called Harriet Street without needing to add Roe to the title. They went through the structure of a plea where identity wasn't contested, but truth still needed to be told in full. They talked about how to count harm without turning victims into exhibits. They quoted the line that has become a principle in this story. Say the victims' names first, keep them at the center. Don't let the person who caused the grief own the narrative. If you walk that end of town at dusk now, you'll see things that look like contradiction and are really recovery. A kid practicing a chip kick in the margin between curb and fence. A jogger checking a watch right where a police tent once stood. A neighbor hosing the lemon tree in a summer that refuses to be anything but a summer. You might pass someone who pauses at the gate with a hand on the post and then keeps moving. That's how grief travels. One foot, then the next. The family's friends found ways to talk about the Roes that made rooms feel warmer. They told stories you can tell in front of kids. Andrew's knack for fixing things that didn't belong to him. Rose's insistence that you take an extra sandwich for later. And how it always tasted better when she'd packed it. Chantel's voice down a hall, the one you heard before you saw her. Laughter half a second ahead of the joke. Those are the details that keep a house human when a file tries to flatten it. There were hard days, and there will be more. Anniversaries that don't ask permission to be heavy, news stories that use the case as shorthand for horror, newcomers to town who learn the history by accident and ask questions in the wrong tone. Kapunda has practiced its responses. We remember them. We look after each other. We don't sensationalize. If you need help, say so. If you can help, do. Part 4 ends where the town chose to live, not by forgetting, but by refusing to let the worst thing be the only thing. The case stayed in the books. The lessons stayed in the room. And the people who loved Andrew, Rose, and Chantel kept them present in sentences that felt like sunlight. The end of a case is not the end of a story. When the courtroom lights dim and the file goes to a shelf, what remains are the simple things people choose to keep. In Kapunda, that meant carrying the Rose forward in ways that didn't require a microphone. Acts you can do with your hands, sentences you can say without rehearsing, habits that make an ordinary street feel like itself again. Start with the names. Andrew first, because that's how breakfast was set. Kettle on, radio low, something being fixed before it broke. He was the person you called when a hinge protested or a fence leaned. He did the job properly, with 2 extra screws because one day wind would test the work. Rose next, the welcome at the door, the plate you didn't ask for but were always glad to have. She had that quiet kind of attention that makes a conversation go deeper, without getting heavy. How are you really? Do you need anything? Here's a container for later. Bring it back when you remember. And Chantel, 16, full of forward motion, filling rooms before she turned the corner. Friends remembered the way she told stories, hands moving, laughter half a beat ahead of the point, plans stacking faster than the calendar could hold. In the right order, their names feel like a rhythm you can learn by heart. Andrew, Rose, Chantel. What the town kept most fiercely was the refusal to let the worst night write the last paragraph. People talked about work, not only grief. They kept the lemon tree going. They made sure the nature strip stayed neat. A neighbor fixed the letterbox because Andrew would have, and somehow that mattered more than a plaque. The local club printed 3 initials small in the season booklet. Not a shrine, just a line that said, "We're not letting you slide off the page." Teachers did what teachers do. They turned pain into literacy. In health classes, the words boundary, jealousy, obsession, and consent went from buzzwords to tools. Students practiced how to say no plainly and how to hear it without looking for a loophole. They rehearsed what to do when someone won't accept an answer. Step away. Tell a friend. Tell an adult. Make a plan that doesn't apologize for being safe. Boys, especially, got space to talk about feelings before feelings became fuses. How to sit with embarrassment. How to leave when pride is loud. How to ask for help without naming it weakness. The lesson wasn't fear, it was fluency. Police and prosecutors turned the case into craft. New detectives learned to read a house as if it still had a voice. They mapped how a timeline is built so a jury can follow it with their finger. They studied post-offense behavior, why turning up at a vigil is not exoneration, how questions about knives and shoes can be self-portrait more than curiosity. They practiced the discipline of saying victims' names first in every briefing. They practiced explaining motive without giving it myth. They practiced ending sentences where they should end, not where appetite wants them to. The family's friends built a kind of maintenance plan for hard dates. Anniversaries were spoken about early. Someone booked a table for breakfast. Someone else did the supermarket run. The phone tree checked in the night before so the morning didn't arrive alone. They made room for every answer. Busy, fine, not today, yes, please. They learned to keep a spare chair at gatherings so people could move in and out without making a speech. Grief prefers options to obligations. Kapunda wrote a small list. It didn't print, but everyone knows. Share your route. Answer the check-in text. Walk each other the extra 100 meters because the last stretch can be the longest. Trust your instinct when a message reads in the wrong accent. If you're the one who hears "I'm not interested," treat it like a wall that belongs there. If you're the friend who sees warning signs, be annoying and kind at the same time. Text me when you're in is not control. It's care with a clock on it. The legal number, 35 years before a gate can even be discussed, settled into a background hum. It is a promise of protection and a placeholder for a future board to ask hard questions no one can answer today. Has insight replaced explanations? Has remorse outlived consequences? Is risk truly reduced, not just rehearsed? The town didn't spend time arguing with arithmetic. It used the quiet the number granted to rebuild ordinary things, routines, confidence, how a twilight walk sounds under gum trees. There were stories the community decided to tell on purpose because they repaired something naming had broken. A tradie remembered Andrew refusing payment with a laugh and then accepting a six-pack because dignity prefers a fair trade. A cousin talked about Rose's way of sending you home with leftovers in containers that never matched, like she'd planned for generosity not to come back. A friend described Chantel teaching a younger kid a TikTok dance and pretending to get it wrong so the kid could be the expert for once. These are small stories. They are also architecture. They put weight back where it was taken. The house itself, people ask about that. What happened to it? Whether anyone could live there again? The answer is simple and kind. A home is not a headline. Whatever became of it belongs to the living. If you walk past, let your eyes face forward and your feet keep their honest pace. If you slow, let it be to listen to birds, not to resurrect pictures no neighbor asked to see again. Respect is quiet and practical. It doesn't turn into a tour. What about the boy who wasn't home that night? The one who had to come back to a town that had already learned how to hold him? The best you can say in public is that people kept their promises. They showed up without spectacle. They turned, "How are you?" into "I'm at the shops, need anything?" They let laughter in without making it permission. They didn't mistake resilience for being finished. They left room for the bad days to be bad, and for the good ones not to be guilty. That's what community looks like when it knows the difference between sympathy and stamina. If you want a takeaway that fits in a pocket, try this set of 5. Say the names first: Andrew, Rose, Chantel, and say them like they still live here, because in the ways that count, they do. Keep the ordinary strong: the lift, the text, the spare key at a friend's place, the habit of walking each other the last bit. Teach the words early: no, yes, enough, stop. And teach the listening that makes those words work. Notice the edges. When attention becomes surveillance, when persistence becomes pressure, when a joke insists on landing. Choose care over spectacle. Help quietly. Remember faithfully. Correct gently. And don't let curiosity dress up as compassion. There will always be a moment, years from now, when someone new to Kapunda hears the phrase Harriet Street and asks. The right way to answer is the way the town learned to speak: with care, with clarity, with the victims at the center, and with just enough detail to teach without taking. You can point to the lemon tree and say it still fruits. You can point to the oval and say the season keeps turning. You can point to your own phone and say the group chat still pings at midnight because we walk each other home. We end where we should have begun and never had to leave: at a table. Cut fruit, not just biscuits. A glass topped up without being asked. A laugh from the hallway. A plan for Saturday that assumes Saturday will arrive. The Kapunda triple murder case is a headline the rest of the country needed to understand. For the town, it is 3 people it refuses to let go by turning love into habit. That is what we keep. That is how a street becomes itself again. And that is how you honor a family whose names will always be said in the right order: Andrew, Rose, Chantel. If you want true cases told with care and the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Comment: for Andrew, Rose, and Chantel, to honor them, and share this episode responsibly.